The Peace Summit was finally here, held at a human base on the edge of neutral space, a landmark occasion that everyone hoped would bring stability across worlds. The delegates, a mixture of alien dignitaries and human officials, moved through the wide halls with purpose. Among them, hidden in the background, was Lena, a schoolteacher, not a diplomat or scientist. She'd volunteered to help with childcare, a small but essential role to keep the young ones occupied while their elders discussed peace. Lena didn't mind being overlooked. She was content to watch over the alien children, helping them adjust to their strange, temporary surroundings. Today, she was particularly drawn to a newborn, a tiny alien wrapped snugly in a bright cloth, its eyes large and curious. This child was the offspring of one of the most powerful alien dignitaries, a symbol of unity and new beginnings. Lena marveled at the tiny creature, barely a week old and already so vital to the Alliance's fragile hopes. As Lena rocked the newborn gently, an announcement echoed over the intercom, signaling that the summit's talks were about to begin. The dignitaries and officials moved toward the main hall, leaving their young in the care of human staff members like her. But as Lena looked up from the newborn, a distant, muffled explosion made her heart drop. The lights flickered, and suddenly chaos erupted. The entire base shuddered as if gripped by a violent tremor. An attack was underway. Panic spread as explosions reverberated through the halls, and alarms blared. The dignitaries, flanked by their security, rushed to evacuate, their faces betraying fear and confusion. In the scramble, Lena tried to stay calm, watching as alien and human children alike were hurriedly gathered and led to safer areas. But as she scanned the chaos around her, she saw something that made her heart twist with disbelief. The newborn alien, still swaddled and alone, had been overlooked in the chaos. The baby lay exposed in its little cradle, entirely vulnerable. Lena glanced around, waiting for someone, anyone, to notice the abandoned child. But everyone was too focused on securing their own safety. Even the newborn's own people, fearing for their lives, seemed to have accepted that the child would be a casualty of this unexpected attack. No one looked back. Without a second thought, Lena moved toward the cradle, her pulse pounding in her ears. She knew her priority should be evacuating with the others, yet something deep inside her couldn't bear to leave the newborn to its fate. Ignoring her own fears, she gently lifted the baby, cradling it close to her chest. Its tiny, alien hand wrapped around her finger, and in that instant, Lena's resolve solidified. She wasn't going to let anything happen to this child. Not while she had the strength to protect it. As the other caretakers and alien officials retreated, Lena moved against the current, away from the evacuation routes and toward the base's nursery, hoping it might provide some temporary shelter. The walls shook with every blast, but she held the baby tightly, whispering comforting words, even though she knew it couldn't understand her language. All it could sense was the warmth of her voice and the gentle sway of her movements, enough to keep it calm amid the mayhem. The base's security had already begun coordinating an evacuation, but the attack was relentless, and many of the safe routes were cut off by falling debris. Lena had no official training for such emergencies, yet she moved with a strange, determined instinct, keeping herself low and close to the walls as she sought out paths that would keep them away from the main corridors. She tried not to think about what would happen if they got trapped. Her only focus was on keeping the child safe, away from the fires and the collapsing walls around them. Her mind raced as she searched for a safe place, somewhere that might buy them enough time for the security team to find them. Yet, as she moved through the dim, flickering halls, she realized they were very much alone. Human and alien soldiers alike were too occupied repelling the attack to notice a lone woman carrying an alien infant. In that moment, Lena felt small and insignificant, her fears swelling as she realized how unlikely it was that anyone would come to their aid in time. Still, she pressed on, her steps quick and light. Every time the baby shifted, making small noises, Lena would shush it gently, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. She wasn't sure where she was headed, but each step carried the weight of her determination to protect this life, this little creature she barely knew but already felt fiercely connected to. The base was a maze of ruin, the once clear pathways now choked with rubble and flickering lights casting shadows that stretched and shrank with each passing second. Alarms wailed in the distance, and the acrid smell of smoke filled the air, but Lena kept her focus sharp, clutching the infant close. Her arms burned from the weight and strain, but she barely noticed, her mind consumed with the single purpose of finding safety. Every turn seemed to lead to more debris, more obstacles, and Lena quickly learned that the direct path wasn't an option. Steeling herself, she navigated around jagged edges of fallen panels, ducking low under twisted metal beams. The corridors that once seemed wide and open felt like tight, suffocating tunnels now, each step taking her deeper into the uncertain chaos. Her heart pounded as she heard the heavy footsteps of soldiers in the distance, all moving in the opposite direction. They were too focused on countering the attack, and even if she had called out, they likely wouldn't have heard her over the roar of the alarms and the rattling structure. As she pressed forward, Lena noticed several alien officials huddled together, surrounded by their security. She paused, a glimmer of hope flickering in her chest as she wondered if they might take the child and help her reach safety. But as she stepped forward, ready to call out to them, she heard the dismissive murmur of one of the aliens. They spoke of the child as if it were expendable, as if leaving it behind was simply a necessity of survival. The dignitaries, many of whom were related to the newborn, were too concerned with securing their own safety to consider anything else. Her stomach twisted at their callousness, and the realization hit her hard: she and the child were truly alone. Feeling a renewed sense of determination, she turned away from the officials and moved deeper into the base. The child in her arms stirred, sensing the tension in her body. Lena gently rocked it, whispering soothing words. "It's okay, we're going to get through this," she murmured, more for herself than for the infant, though the gentle hum of her voice seemed to calm it. Navigating through the dimly lit halls, Lena encountered several obstacles that forced her to take alternate routes. At one point, she found herself in a narrow maintenance shaft, the walls pressing close, barely enough room for her to keep moving. She squeezed through, every scrape and bump against the rough metal a reminder of just how vulnerable they were. Her mind raced, calculating every step, scanning each corner for any potential shelter or place of safety. The weight of responsibility bore down on her, but Lena's resolve didn't waver. She found herself drawing strength from an unexpected place, her instincts as a teacher. She'd spent years looking after children, comforting them, protecting them, and it was those instincts that guided her now. Despite the danger, she couldn't let fear take over. For the child's sake, she needed to stay calm, resourceful, focused. The echo of enemy footsteps made her pause, her body tense as she pressed herself against the wall, shielding the baby with her body. The figures moved past, their shadows stretching over her as they scanned the corridor. She held her breath, her grip on the child tightening as the steps grew fainter, eventually fading into the distance. Only when she was certain they were gone did she allow herself to breathe, a wave of relief washing over her. She continued, but every step brought a new challenge. A section of the floor ahead had buckled, leaving a gap she had to navigate around. At another point, a heavy beam had fallen, blocking the main hallway, and Lena was forced to crawl under it, her back pressed low to the ground, keeping the baby cradled close against her chest. Each hurdle seemed designed to test her resolve, but she met them with a grit she hadn't known she possessed. With every obstacle, Lena grew more aware of just how alone they were. The base was vast, a sprawling labyrinth that was both a shield and a trap. She'd known these corridors as safe places where people of all species could walk freely, but now they felt hostile, every inch a reminder of how far she was from rescue. Yet, despite the odds, she couldn't bring herself to give up. Her arms ached from holding the infant, the physical toll catching up to her, but she clung to the strength that surged whenever the child stirred. In its quiet vulnerability, she found a purpose stronger than any she'd felt before. This small, fragile life was depending on her, and that knowledge drove her forward, one cautious step at a time. Her thoughts drifted briefly to how absurd the situation was. She was just a schoolteacher, an ordinary human with no combat training, no experience in surviving under siege. And yet here she was, facing these challenges with a courage she hadn't known was within her. This child, who had no one else in the universe, was in her care. Her heart hardened with the knowledge that she would not fail. As she made her way through the next hall, she silently vowed that they would make it out of this. At last, Lena reached what used to be the base's nursery, though it was barely recognizable under the rubble. Metal beams hung at odd angles, and the ceiling had partially collapsed, but she pressed on, determined to find a spot to catch her breath and check on the infant. The air was thick with dust, making it difficult to breathe, but the child nestled in her arms seemed miraculously calm, as if sensing her protective embrace. Gently, she adjusted her grip, securing the baby in a makeshift sling she'd fashioned from a strip of cloth torn from her own shirt. She whispered soft words to the child, her voice barely above a whisper, hoping to offer comfort amidst the chaos. As she cradled it, the baby's tiny hand reached up and brushed against her cheek. The touch was delicate, almost a reminder of the sheer innocence and fragility she was carrying. In that instant, her exhaustion faded, replaced by a fierce resolve to keep this life safe, no matter the cost. Just as she prepared to move, a loud crash echoed through the nursery. Part of the ceiling collapsed nearby, sending a shower of dust and debris around them. Lena shielded the baby, her body instinctively curling to protect it. Every instinct screamed at her to move faster, but with the child in her arms, every step needed to be measured and careful. She couldn't afford a single misstep. Balancing caution with urgency, Lena scanned the area, spotting a narrow corridor on the opposite side that looked relatively clear of debris. It wasn't ideal, but it was their only option. She adjusted the sling to ensure the baby was secure and stepped forward, her eyes sharp, her movements steady. As they progressed, the air grew colder, a reminder of the life support systems struggling to keep up under the strain of the attack. Lena wrapped her arms tighter around the child, hoping her body warmth would offer some comfort. She was beginning to feel the strain in her legs, the weight of fatigue pressing down, but each time she glanced at the baby's small, peaceful face, she found the strength to push on. Moving slowly, she kept her senses on high alert, every nerve attuned to the slightest sound or movement. At one point, she heard voices echoing from a nearby hallway. Fear tightened her chest, but she forced herself to remain calm, focusing on the child's soft breathing to keep her nerves steady. The voices faded, and they were alone again, the silence only interrupted by distant crashes and the occasional shudder of the structure. Suddenly, a faint beeping sound caught her attention, coming from an emergency medical kit partially buried under rubble. She quickly scanned it, finding a small oxygen supply and a thermal blanket, both intended for emergencies. Carefully, she wrapped the thermal blanket around the baby, its warmth providing a layer of comfort. The oxygen mask, though far too large for the infant, could be adjusted to deliver a small flow of air, ensuring they'd both have a bit more time. Lena's hands moved with precision, years of caregiving coming back to her instinctively. She wasn't a soldier, wasn't trained for this kind of danger, but she knew how to care. And right now, that was all that mattered. Once she'd secured the mask and adjusted the blanket, she took a deep breath and steadied herself. She couldn't linger here. Every moment spent was a gamble, a risk she couldn't afford to take. They moved forward, Lena's senses heightened with each step. Her muscles ached, and her mind grew foggy from exhaustion, but her focus never wavered. At one point, the baby began to fuss, a small whimper escaping its lips. Lena gently swayed, whispering soft reassurances, her voice a steady anchor in the surrounding chaos. The child's cries softened, its tiny hand reaching up as if seeking reassurance. The sight struck her deeply. This child, who knew nothing of her, trusted her implicitly. It was an unspoken bond that transcended species, a fragile connection born in the crucible of survival. And in that moment, Lena knew she would give everything to protect this life. She wasn't simply fleeing the enemy or fighting her way out of a dangerous situation. She was ensuring that this child, this innocent, would see another day. As they neared the exit, the walls shook with renewed intensity. The attack outside had escalated, the explosions closer now, their echoes filling the air with an almost deafening roar. Lena's pulse quickened, but she held steady, her grip on the infant tightening. They were close. She could feel it. But just as she rounded the final corner, a beam overhead gave way, crashing down in front of them. The way forward was blocked, the corridor filled with dust and debris. Lena's heart pounded as she assessed the situation, her mind racing for options. She couldn't go back. The sound of approaching footsteps hinted that enemy forces were closing in, their relentless march echoing down the halls. With a sharp intake of breath, Lena surveyed the surroundings and noticed a small, narrow passage created by the fallen beam. It wasn't much, barely wide enough for her to squeeze through, but it would have to do. Carefully, she crouched, adjusting the baby in her arms as she inched forward, her body pressed against the cold metal, each movement deliberate and measured. The passage was tight, every scrape of her clothing against the walls reminding her of how close they were to being trapped. But finally, she emerged on the other side, her breath heavy, her body trembling with a mix of fear and relief. She couldn't afford to rest, though. The exit was within sight, a few precious steps away. She moved forward, her pace quickening as she felt the first fresh gust of air in what felt like an eternity. The infant stirred, its eyes opening briefly, looking up at her with a silent trust that brought a lump to her throat. She whispered one last promise, a vow to get them both out alive. And with that, Lena pressed on, her steps sure, her heart steeled by the unbreakable bond she had formed with the tiny life in her arms. They were almost there. Just as Lena took those final steps toward the exit, a surge of relief washed over her, tempered only by the reality that they still weren't safe. She tightened her grip on the infant, feeling its warmth through the thermal blanket as the cool air of the emergency bay hit her. They had reached a small pocket of safety, but the sound of footsteps nearby jolted her back to alertness. Human forces, finally breaking through the enemy line, had arrived. She managed to flag down a few of the soldiers, her voice cracking with exhaustion as she called out. They moved quickly to her side, their eyes widening when they saw her carrying the alien child. Relief crossed their faces, realizing this child had been saved in the chaos. One of them offered to take the baby, but Lena held on for a moment longer, a silent exchange that spoke of all she'd risked to get here. She gently handed over the infant, feeling the weight of her journey settle as the baby was secured in safe hands. At that moment, alien dignitaries emerged from the rescue teams, scanning the area in a mix of disbelief and awe. The child's parent, who had been told the infant might not have survived, stared at Lena in silence, struggling to reconcile the scene before them. Here was a human, exhausted, barely able to stand, who had risked her life for a child not even of her species. The dignitaries' gaze softened, the enormity of Lena's actions settling upon them as they reached out to take their child. Yet, they couldn't fully understand why she'd done it. Among the aliens, survival was often prioritized with cold pragmatism. A life lost in chaos was a tragedy, but it was accepted. Lena's actions, however, had been guided by an unyielding belief in the value of every life, no matter how small or how different. As the dignitary held their child, they turned back to Lena, an expression of gratitude and respect overtaking their initial shock. In their culture, gestures of such loyalty and compassion were rare, especially from an outsider. The other aliens, witnessing this simple act of care that transcended cultural divides, began to look at Lena and the humans with a newfound understanding. The human soldiers, sensing the profound significance of this moment, stayed silent, letting the dignitaries take in what had unfolded. It was more than just the survival of an infant. It was a testament to humanity's resilience and capacity to protect, even when the stakes were highest. Lena, meanwhile, stood quietly, her shoulders heavy with fatigue yet her heart lighter than it had been since the attack began. She'd fulfilled her promise, kept this innocent life safe against all odds. In a gesture that surprised her, the dignitary stepped forward and offered a formal bow, a gesture of respect among their kind, rarely extended to other species. Lena, taken aback, returned the gesture, feeling a weighty gratitude in their gaze. She knew her actions had meant more than she could fully comprehend. In saving one life, she demonstrated a strength of character that couldn't be quantified by any diplomatic negotiation or alliance. News of the incident spread quickly, becoming a story that would be shared across worlds. Humans, it seemed, were capable of profound acts of courage, driven by empathy and compassion rather than cold logic or calculated survival. The alliance, once held together by fragile political ties, now had something deeper, a shared understanding born from one person's decision to protect a helpless child. As the dignitaries regrouped, discussing the path forward in a way that seemed less formal and more genuinely collaborative, Lena was gently led to the medics. Exhausted but deeply satisfied, she allowed herself a moment to breathe, watching the dignitaries exchange words with her fellow humans. This alliance was no longer just a treaty signed in good faith. It was becoming something real, grounded in respect and a mutual appreciation for what humanity had proven it could offer. For Lena, the journey ended with the knowledge that she'd done something that mattered. She'd been just a teacher, not a soldier or a diplomat, yet her actions had left an indelible mark. As she watched the aliens cradle their child, knowing they now saw humans through a lens of respect, she felt a quiet pride. This was more than a rescue. It was a reminder that even in the darkest times, humanity's greatest strength lay in its ability to protect and cherish life, regardless of species. And in that moment, Lena knew she'd given them all something priceless, a reason to hope, a reason to trust, and a reason to believe that together, they could face whatever challenges lay ahead.